Hi, and welcome to this special interview with the Canadian Donation and Transplantation Research Program. My name is Stéphanie, and I'm the CDTRP Communications Manager. It is my pleasure to meet today with Dr. Caroline Tait as part of the National Indigenous History Month. Dr. Caroline Tait is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Saskatchewan and a member of the Métis Nation Saskatchewan. She grew up in a small Métis community in central Saskatchewan. Caroline is also the co-founder of the Saskatchewan First Nation and Métis Organ Donation and Transplantation Research Network, made up of knowledge keepers, persons with lived experience, researchers, physicians, and students. Today, we will discuss a recent publication entitled Challenges Facing Indigenous Transplant Patients Living in Canada, Exploring Equity and Utility in Organ Transplantation Decision-Making. Welcome, Caroline. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today.
Well, thank you for the invitation.
Can you please start us off with some background for those who may be less familiar with the challenges Indigenous transplant patients living in Canada face, and tell us what led you to develop this research project?
So I believe it was about 3 years ago, maybe a little bit more, that I became interested in organ donation and transplantation and what was happening for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And so I started working with Dr. Mike Moser at the University of Saskatchewan, and he's a transplant surgeon. And we decided to create a think tank. And the think tank had First Nations and Métis elders and knowledge keepers and other medical folks. And so with the network that we put together, of course, it was a research network. So I was very interested in what are the areas that we need to research, and quickly found out that there was very limited information about organ donation and transplantation in terms of publications, so academic publications and research, but also very little public health information. There's really nothing that I could find that targeted Indigenous peoples. And so then as I learned more about organ donation and transplantation and how decisions are made and the ways in which people donate organs and the ways in which people are donor recipients, it became clear to me that much of the work and the discussion and decision making was based in large urban centers, because that's where the transplant programs are. And that because there's a shortage of organs, so at any given time we don't have enough organs in the country. And so because there was a shortage of organs, that this meant that access to organ transplant was very much focused on patients who were living in proximity to transplant programs. And so I don't have any data in terms of whether or not people who receive transplants are more likely to live in large urban centers or not, and what proximity to a transplant program means or doesn't mean. So I don't have that data. But what was really interesting to me was, okay, so do First Nations, Métis, and Inuit have equitable access to organs as everyone else? Because the value within the transplant discourse and I really believe that people are invested in this, in the transplant community, the medical people, the decision makers, and even governments, I think, are committed to equity, meaning that each and every one of us has access equally to an organ transplant if we should need one. And so along with organ transplant comes utility, the question of utility, of who gets to make the decision about who gets an organ, and how do they base that decision? What are the factors that they base that decision on? So a utility argument means that the optimal, so in terms of utility, optimally you would place the organ in a patient that would have the best chance for that organ to last the longest. right? So very simple, right? But so the question that then came to mind is are Indigenous people disadvantaged in terms of equity and utility? So what does that mean? So that's when I started to look into the literature, and I was really motivated by the question of where do we begin the conversation? Where do we begin to look at equity and utility? Where do we begin to understand? And so that was the real motivation behind the paper.
Great. Thank you very much for telling us about this very important work. My first question would be, did you experience any challenges throughout this project? And if so, could you please describe what steps you took to overcome them?
Yeah, so in researching the paper, you know, we were in COVID, so it was at a time when the paper was researched that we weren't allowed by the university to do in-person interviews. And prior to COVID, doing interviews with an Indigenous person, so I did community-based research, doing interviews online would have been really frowned upon and not seen as ethical research. And so at the time that I started researching the paper, I didn't have access to do interviews with people. So what I did, as any researcher, I went into the literature to see, well, what do we know and what don't we know? And I was really quick to discover that in order to answer my question around equity and utility, that I really needed to have data. And there was no data. So I framed the question and was working with our think tank at that time, you know, going back and forth and working with different experts in ODT. And of course, you know, going into the research literature, and I, you know, again, looking at the literature around end stage organ failure generally. So not just the transplant literature, but the literature, you know, looking at kidney disease, liver disease, heart disease, and you know, and so looking to see, well, where Indigenous people talked about. And so in terms of the equity issues, it was clear that as we know from health generally, so there's quite a bit of literature around barriers and gaps in healthcare services for Indigenous peoples. And certainly the literature, so kidneys are the most transplanted organ and the organ that is most in need. And that it was clear that, you know, we really in Saskatchewan, but in other places, particularly in northern and remote regions, rural areas, that there is no dialysis, for instance. So people were really, you know, having to travel long distances. And so if you were Indigenous and lived in northern Saskatchewan, for instance, you're looking at potentially traveling several times a week, you know, a 5-hour return trip or more. And so what does this mean? And what does this mean in relation to people's experience? And then on top of that, when we're looking at equity, geography came out as being an absolute clear issue that that repeats itself in many ways in terms of disadvantaging people. And it was really interesting. I can't remember the name of the author, but I cite them in my paper that made this very important point about how, you know, in healthcare often, you know, in Canada in healthcare often, the North is seen to be a problem, or the North is challenging. And that, so people from the South looking to the North, all they see are challenges, because you have vast amounts of land where very few people live, and you don't have the same types of healthcare services. So you certainly don't have the type of hospital that you would find, for instance, in Edmonton or Vancouver. And so the North is always seen to be this challenge, where for people who live in the North, that's the norm. So part of what I was trying to do was to situate the conversation, and what I try to do with my work is situate it more in the context of Northern life. and Northern realities and the lived experience of living in the North, where the North is the norm. So it's not seen as a problem by people, right? So, but when we looked at geography, of course, if you're looking at transplant, for instance, you have to comply. So the idea of compliance came up over and over again in ways in which people may be, because of geography, because of poverty, language barriers, all kinds of intersecting factors that may mean that for reasons beyond the control of the person. So if you don't have transportation to have the workup you need for your transplant, right? If you have a storm that happens and you can't get to where you need to get to. So there's all kinds of reasons that geography plays in to the ways in which end-stage organ failure and transplant play out. And this means that there isn't equitable access. So Indigenous people are disadvantaged for many, many ways. Mistrust of the healthcare system is another one, right? So the idea that, like people not feeling comfortable with signing their donor cards, and people feeling, that if they're an organ donor, that end of or life-saving measures won't be taken, right? So life-saving measures won't be taken because they want their organs, right? And so there's all kinds of perceptions. So there's a number of competing things that some are practical things like geography, some are things that are related to cultural perceptions or to mistrust of the healthcare system, and also the ways in which the progression of illness, the advancement of illnesses that lead to end-stage organ failure can be very complex. But also that it can advance quicker. So if you have illnesses that are advancing quicker in patient populations, what does that mean? So it was really the conclusion that there were equity issues and that Indigenous people were disadvantaged. But then my question was, would they be disadvantaged in the decision-making process around utility? Right? When transplant teams are asking the question, who gets this organ? And I felt, and certainly my research and analysis lead me to believe that Indigenous people are also disadvantaged. And the reasons why is around that question of compliance. So we know that as transplant teams are making their decision, they're weighting at any given time the question of, if the person can't comply to what we need them to do prior to a transplant, are they going to comply after the transplant? So we're not going to give someone an organ, we're not going to transplant an organ to somebody that can't comply with the daily routine of post-transplant care. And so once again, if you look at questions of geography and other types of questions, that it really pointed in the direction that around decision making, that there could be another disadvantage, so that the intersection between equity issues and utility issues, when you look at Indigenous peoples, compounded the reality that they either wouldn't be placed on a transplant list or they wouldn't receive a transplant. So that brings me back to the data question. And in the paper, basically saying, while I'm saying all of this, the fact is we don't know. So because we don't know the number of Indigenous people who have end-stage organ failure, we don't know the number of people who are not being placed on the transplant list and why they're not being placed. We don't know the number of people that are placed on the transplant list but never receive a transplant because they pass away before receiving it. We don't know if those percentages are higher than the general population or not. We expect that they are. And we don't know whether, what the life expectancy or how long people are living post-transplant. So there's many, many different questions that we don't know. And the reason that we don't know this is because we're not looking, we have no way in most jurisdictions, there's limited ways to track health utilization. So we don't have health utilization, and we really need distinctions-based health utilization data. And what I mean by that, and actually right now our federal government is moving towards what they call distinctions-based Indigenous health legislation. And this is meant to address equity issues. And so I'm really excited to start to look at how this legislation plans to address equity issues, because organ donation and transplantation is a perfect, I think, case study for that. But what we know is that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are not the same. We know that geography plays a part. And so what we really need is we need health utilization data that we can line up with postal codes, for instance, where people live, that we can look at urban versus rural versus remote, provinces versus territories, provinces like Saskatchewan that only do kidney donation versus provinces like Alberta that does all transplants. So we only do kidney transplants here, and all of our people go to Edmonton. So there's a number of different areas that we need this data. And so part of the purpose behind the paper was to say, in all likelihood, this is what's happening. But without the data, it's very difficult for our Indigenous health leaders to make any kind of an argument for improved services to address those equity issues and that. And so I really, a foundational piece of the article was that organ donation and transplantation decision makers, including governments and people who run transplant programs, whenever they're sitting at tables and making decisions, they need to include our Indigenous health leaders. And so the example I'll give is that there was an informal audit done by my colleague, Mike Moser at the University of Saskatchewan, the Saskatchewan Transplant Program. And what Dr. Moser and his group found was that upward of 50% of the people in Saskatchewan waiting for a kidney transplant were First Nations status people. So they knew they were First Nations because the status number. So it was just an informal audit. There's nothing published, but it just, them just taking a quick peek to look to see is shocking, because the First Nations people of Saskatchewan are less than, like Métis and First Nations are 15% of the population of Saskatchewan. So this was only First Nations on reserve, not Métis and not non-status First Nations who live off reserve. So that means that we can suggest that maybe the rates are higher. We also know that kidney disease and diabetes in Métis communities may not be as strong as it is amongst First Nations. So the rates may not be as high. So we can't lump Indigenous people all together. We need to have distinctions-based data, so that, because the experiences may be very different for all kinds of reasons. We don't know socioeconomic class, how that impacts our people. So there's a number of different things that I think, we're lacking data. So this article was really meant to give a tool and a resource to our Indigenous health leaders, so that when they want to talk about organ donation and transplantation, they have a very, I think, a solid argument in this paper to make for better data.
Great. Oh, this is so interesting and enlightening. So many good information. I invite everyone to read the paper. The link will be in the article. What are the future directions for this work, and how could CDTRP and its member get involved?
Yeah, so this, as I said, is a foundation. I really see this article as a foundational piece, and there is another foundational piece that I hope to publish. There's two foundational pieces that I hope will be published soon. One is on the think tank and the value of how the think tank created reconciliation between the medical folks who work in the area of organ donation and transplantation and First Nations and Métis knowledge keepers and elders and researchers and students. And so it was really meant to create this space of possibility, of which we weren't rushing, through an exercise of getting together for 2 or 3 days at a hotel and having a conference, or getting together and having, some kind of workshop, and, we power through activities. The think tank was meant to be, the word think is right in the center of it. And it was meant to be a thought, kind of a thought experiment, I guess. And so the idea was, what would happen if you brought Indigenous people, community people, many of whom are think tank members, had backgrounds in health, or, some were residential school survivors, some are traditional elders, and we had a former transplant nurse, and so our Indigenous people were people that had experiences that they didn't have expertise necessarily in organ donation and transplantation, but they were well respected people with a great deal of cultural and practical knowledge and lived experience. And then, so then it meant that people from outside who were experts, organ transplant people, researchers, legal people, would come into our think tank, and they would present to us. And then we allowed lots of time to have a rich discussion and dialogue back and forth. And it worked so much better than I thought it would. And even with COVID, we were initially in person. And so we were limited in some ways in terms of our presenters. So we had government, like people in Saskatchewan, present, but when COVID hit, we went online. And once we got our elders comfortable with online work, and not all of them were comfortable, and not all of them had internet access to participate, but of those that participated, we were then able to pull people from different parts. And so CDTRP played an absolute central role. David Hartel at that time, Melanie was, also, and we had other people who came and spoke to us. And then through CDTRP, which was really brilliant, is that then we linked in with people across the country, like John Gill, Jag Gill. We linked into a group at Western University, U of T folks. We linked in with ethicists and transplant folks, Aviva Goldberg in Manitoba, who's absolutely brilliant and wonderful. And it provided this rich context. And then also CDTRP facilitated, I think it might have been at that time David Hartel, but there was help for me to be able to sit on the National ODT decision-making group, of which, I arrived to find that there were no other Indigenous people, except I think Mary Bocage is on that group as well. And Mary and I have, are working closely together. And I so greatly appreciate Mary, and she's just amazing. So that was, we kind of created dialogue and discussion where I was quite surprised to find how little there was, so Mary Smith at Queen's University is a researcher, but there's very few, and so it's been weird to occupy this space so fully. And I'm really hoping that we can, expand so we have, attract students and others to work in this area, which I think it's fascinating. And so as we move forward, there's the think tank piece, which is the foundational piece about collective intelligence, we call it. So we really felt like we were building collective intelligence with the transplant community. So the Indigenous community and the transplant community came together, building collective intelligence of this back and forth knowledge sharing over periods of time. So people who were experts in ODT could flow in and out of our circle, and they were invited to come whenever they wanted to. And it really, I think in many ways, what I saw the reaction of some of the people that came to our think tank was a great deal of humility. an appreciation for the fact that there was this space. And I really believe the space became a space of reconciliation. And CDTRP, particularly Melanie and David, and now Patricia, really has facilitated that. It allowed us to then build more into an international network, which I'm just about to reinvigorate again, because it's been a while since we've been in touch with our international partners, because I wasn't sure what to do with that group. But we really hope to have a larger meeting with them. And one of the areas that Mary Bocage and I are very interested in, and we've spoke to Health Canada about this, and in some ways, I admit, Mary's, I think, better knowledgeable about it, but the idea of preemptive transplant. So could there be a strategy that for people who are living with kidney disease, and it's pretty clear that they're going to need dialysis, is there a way that using living donation, that preemptive transplant could mean that people never go on dialysis, so they're not having to make those long journeys? And so is this something that is medically sound, that we could potentially, look at promoting this with our Indigenous health leaders as a way, so that when people are told that, you're probably going to need to go on dialysis in a year or two, that people could start working towards a transplant by identifying a living donor and by moving towards placement on the transplant list in a preemptive way. So we don't know whether this is a strategy that may address that equity issue around geography, right? So could this potentially, because the equity issue around geography is very much related to dialysis, and so is now, it doesn't play out in maybe with other organs, maybe somewhat with liver, but the living donation avenue. And so then part of our research around living donors is, we started research looking at living donation in Indigenous peoples. I thought people would have a great deal to say about the operation itself, that, that this would be, that there would be lots around, decision making about whether you want to have this operation, whether you want to live with one kidney. That hasn't come up hardly at all, hardly at all. But what people are talking about is they're talking about the barriers that prevent them from being a living donor. So really, there's a lot that prevents people from, including geography again, but also financial challenges, transportation challenges, the fact that you have to go through this huge, enormous workup, and it's over a period of time. And if you live in the North, you're traveling and then having to take time off work, having to either take your vacation or your sick leave, employers not being so, so there's a number of pragmatic, practical issues. And there's people like John Gill, I believe Mary Bocage is working in this area as well. Number of people working at how do we support living donation in a more practical way, that you don't come out of it, not losing money, for instance, or like there shouldn't be a financial burden on the person or a work loss or anything like that for someone to save someone else's life. So we're looking at that. And then the other foundational piece is around presumed consent or deemed consent. And I think, I think there's discussion in the transplant community of people who think this is the way to go and others who feel like this isn't the way to go. That's not really my space. The space that I've carved out in the conversation is really just about Indigenous people and how will this play out, because Nova Scotia, of course, went forward without any consultation with the Mi'kmaq and other First Nations, other Indigenous people living in the province, that they just moved ahead with deemed consent legislation. And, when I talked to colleagues in Nova Scotia, they really didn't know, our First Nations colleagues really didn't know about the legislation, even though the legislation was in place and had been in place for over a year. So so I think, again, the value of this work is, and a key question in deemed consent is, we need to be able to know within a short period of time whether deemed consent legislation, if it results in more people being organ donors, does that mean that there are more Indigenous organ donors than there were before, but Indigenous people are not receiving more organs, right? So that brings us back to that equity and utility, that intersection, right? So that's why that paper is so foundational, because we can't look at, deemed consent legislation unless we're looking at, how will this play out? So, and it goes back to the data question of, should we plow forward with deemed consent legislation? And what should so there's no legal duty to consult with Indigenous peoples, but good governance and good policy means that you take the time to do education and consultation. And Indigenous people are going to be fearful on two, concerns will be that there will be, we'll donate more, but we won't receive more. But also what has come up in the research that we're doing is that people are very mistrustful of the healthcare system. We have all kinds of examples why they should be mistrustful, and some of them are pretty awful, right? And so this idea that you won't get the end of life care or you won't get the life-saving care that you need because you're an organ donor. So whether or not that happens, right? So we can assume in this context it doesn't happen. But if people perceive that it happens and that deemed consent legislation is putting them in this precarious position, if they believe that that's the end result, then from my point of view, I want to be protective of Indigenous people, but I believe I'm tasked with the moral responsibility to protect the organ transplant reputation, the image of organ transplant, the image of organ donation. So as somebody who works in this area, my area of caution, or my word of caution to people is, be careful as you move forward without education and consultation, that you may end up with an unexpected result that means that it tarnishes the perception, people's perception of organ donation and transplantation as not being safe. And if you look at the anthropological literature that exists, we see this happened in Japan. We see it happen in Brazil. So we know that that quickly the tide can change by people having a perception that may not necessarily be true, but because there hasn't been proper education and proper consultation, and something is pushed through and moved through too quickly, that then you end up in it with unexpected consequences.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for your precious time. Do you have any final words to share with our listeners before we leave?
Just that I really believe that the organ donation context in Canada is a small. I've learned that it's a bit of a small community context in many ways, of which people, because I think of what they're doing, are exceptionally thoughtful in many ways. So not only thoughtful to the patients, but as thoughtful to the families. And I think that it's a gentle type of space within healthcare. And it has to be gentle because of the sensitivity and because it's so important to protect the reputation of transplant programs and the idea of a transplant, the idea of someone giving their organs and those organs being placed in different individuals to save their lives. And because of that, I think as an Indigenous health researcher, it becomes a really fertile environment of which to look at issues of cultural safety, to look at issues of reconciliation, and to look at ways in which the ODT, I've had people in my study that are going through kidney transplant, and I haven't heard people talk about racism. And some of that is because of the intimate relationship they have with their transplant team. So there has been, I shouldn't say that that's not true. I have had one individual, so it can happen, and it can happen in different ways, right? But I think what I'm saying is that I think generally that, the experiences of people are positive because they're having life-saving measures, right? And which is a transplant. I think, we do need to know more. I think some of the stuff around end of life and procurement of organs and the experiences of families that go through making that decision is important. But I do think that it's a very interesting and important area that, while I'm looking at organ donation and transplantation, I can speak to these larger issues generally of equity and utility, healthcare access, and even in terms of, intergenerational trauma and colonization, and all of those things that make Indigenous health research, this very complex area to work in. So I'm very happy I landed where I landed.
Thank you very much again, Caroline.
Thank